Thank you, Alex. I try not to think about how to begin. I bring little pieces of paper up here and see what comes of it, but I do know that I am slightly nervous this time because I have never lectured to anyone who's paid $8. That's what you pay to see Lawrence of Arabia. And I assure you that you will see nothing so fine as that here. In fact, what you will find is much of what I say is depressing, and when you laugh, ask yourself whether you're laughing because it's funny or whether it's a nervous laugh, asking whether it's a nervous laugh of recognition that this, in fact, is the life that either you have led or you are destined to lead. And it's a curious feeling when you see some of these images. Hardly a day goes by without something happening in the press. I knew that I would run across something, and I could hardly believe it when I found this article on the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, who had made a report. They had done a model of the year 2010 on Route 9. Well, here's the story. It's actually worse than I thought. You're well on your way to becoming Los Angeles by 2010. Route 9 by the year 2010 will be bumper to bumper from 9 o'clock in the morning to 10 p.m. There will be, the traffic in general, not just Route 9, but in general, will be 450% worse. Nothing will be 450% worse, not even inflation, by that time. The number of cars on the road will increase by 97%, which is way ahead of the population increase. And I could go on reading and reading, but perhaps the one that is the most damaging is that worldwide pollution and energy consumption will be 350% greater than it is today, which of course is unsustainable. All this is tied together, and very intimately tied together with the way the suburbs are designed. That's the bad news. The good news is that I believe that things can be done very quickly, gratifyingly quickly, from the experiences that we've had in the last few years. So let's start. This is Silicon Valley. You have one of these here. It's called Route 386, or it's got an 8 in it. That's all I know. It's famous. It's rather well known. The question is, it's exactly the kind of growth that you should be going for. It's well-paid, clean industry. People who work here should be happy workers. Why is it, then, that the level of stress and the level of anxiety and the number of psychologists and so forth in California is so high, and especially high in a place like this? Well, it has to do with the competition. It has to do with whatever the California ethos is, but it also has to do with the lifestyle. The kind of congestion that is going on here, the kind of life, the kind of expense, and all of these things that you'll be hearing about in detail is related not to the growth of Silicon Valley, but in fact it's related to the type of urbanism that followed upon its heels. And I think that can be unhinged, that growth does not necessarily mean this type of urbanism and this type of life. The great political issues of the 90s will be growth issues. There are politicians, council members, and so forth everywhere in this country getting elected on no-growth platforms. I know that now Cape Cod has the Cape Cod Commission Act is virtually a moratorium on growth, and it is a very crude tool that is being used there. You cannot stop growth that way. What you can do, and that's the argument that I'll make, is you can direct growth to occur in desirable patterns. Growth can continue occurring the way it always has along the lines of traditional towns and villages. There's nothing that militates against that. The American small town, a most marvelous organism, and not a very complex one in terms of design. Let me describe some of its principal characteristics. Here are little houses, dwellings of different types, different sizes, and although there's a great deal of variety, they seem to be highly ordered relative to this space in front of them, which is called the street. The street consists of trees, generally lined up, people, places like sidewalks and lawns, and also automobiles, all mixed together. Somewhere within a fabric like this one, there is often other uses like a corner store, a cafe, a daycare center, and so forth. But they're not large. They're approximately the same size as the houses, so they do not disturb the houses. Elsewhere, bigger uses are located. Here, for example, is a civic building. It's probably a church, but it could just as well be a city hall or a school. And in front of it is a larger space called a square, which is a defined space. It's a space that's like a room. And around it are bigger buildings, possibly the bigger shops, the offices, and so forth. And they are in a relationship which is a meaningful relationship. An important space in front of an important building, and an unimportant space in front of unimportant buildings. It's all mixed together very nicely. It is conceivable that you can drive around this town, but it is also conceivable that you can walk from one place to the other. This is what it looks like from ground view. This is Princeton, New Jersey, and I'm very careful to show only desirable places, because the constant theme of this, from the developer's point of view, is that people like so much to live in small towns that they will actually pay more to live in them than they will in a development. Princeton has fantastically high real estate values, and here you see the elements that I referred to earlier, the shops in this case, this is a commercial district, the shops in the first floor, the cars on the street, the sidewalks, the trees, and people or offices living above the store. An entirely mixed-use proposition, a very finely grained place. The other model is this one. Now you laugh, because this is somehow an unfair comparison. This is the model of town which is being envisioned now. This is the model of urbanism which is being envisioned for our suburbs. And I'm reading this caption: becoming a showcase. Virginia Beach Boulevard Phase 1 celebrated its opening. This is actually from a promotional brochure of the city of Virginia Beach, which has gone from a relatively nice place to a notoriously miserable place. You say Virginia Beach and people say, oh, too bad. Well, that is because this is the model of the city which is envisioned. Now let's go over it. Here, there are 7 or 8 or 10 lanes of traffic, because it is axiomatic that the modern city, the well-planned city, should have traffic flowing very freely. Cars must be happy in their road along the way. And a lot of the planning and a lot of the expense that goes on has to do with cars being happy. And cars must also be happy where they stop, which is why you find these enormous parking lots that are actually 9/10 or 9.5 or 95% of the time. Only 7 days of the year, the principal shopping days after Thanksgiving, are the commercial parking lots fully used. The rest of the time, they're half empty. Why? Because it is completely un-American to not find a parking spot in the suburb. The minute you can't find a parking spot, no growth, moratorium, bad planning, change the politicians, whatever. That is it seems to be one of the great American rights. Now, there are sidewalks here. Somebody's conscience has been provided for. But you know perfectly well that no one has ever been here, unless, of course, an indigent. And if you have ever been unfortunate enough to be seen walking in the suburbs, you know that it's an embarrassing situation. This poor man, his car must have broken, or he doesn't own a car. Everything that you see here is commercial. Here is the shopping center. Here is the drive-through teller for the bank. Here is the Pizza Hut. Here is the McDonald's. Everything that you see is a single use. No one lives here, nor do they live sufficiently near here to be able to get here by walking. It's an entirely automobile society. That's another part, which is very important, about the modern planned suburb. Uses are rigorously separated. People live in one place, and people shop in another, and people work in a third one, and all the medical facilities are in a fourth, and all the industrial parks are in a fifth. The rigorous separation is like religion to the current planners. And here it is from eye level. Now, you say, well, pretty ugly, isn't it? Yeah, it's ugly, but everything here is by code. Everything. Everything has been rigorously specified. The size of the parking spot, of the parking place, the number of parking places, the setback of the building, the amount of light, the quality of the paint, the drainage pattern, the thickness of the asphalt. Every single thing has been specified to the nth degree, because the planning codes really care an awful lot about the cars and about parking. There is nothing in it about what it feels like to be here, what the pedestrian life is like. This is a zoning code, a very modern one. You can tell it's modern because it's at least 2.5 inches thick. It is zealously administered by the zoning administration of Dade County. Perhaps 100 people administer this code. The longer they administer it, the worse Dade County gets. The worse the traffic, the uglier it gets, so on and so forth. What is the problem? The problem is that the wrong city is being modeled. The automobile city is the destiny of most of our suburbs. It is not an aesthetic issue. I know this is not a terribly ugly street. It's just a medium ugly street. The problem is not the aesthetic problem. The problem is that this vehicle is the only means by which a suburbanite can be in the public realm, the time spent in public. Now, after years of social legislation, we find ourselves in a society that allots us 1 free hour between the place of dwelling and the place of work, and another free hour between the place of work and the place of dwelling in the evening. We have an hour. After that, we have to go home, feed the kids, mow the lawn, and various social responsibilities. But we do have 2 hours to ourselves. In the current model of the suburb, those 2 hours are spent in the most stressful and expensive way imaginable, which is competing with your fellow citizen for asphalt, which is in scarce supply, which is why in the suburbs citizens tend to so drastically dislike each other. Now, I have a slide that comes next that I haven't put in the lecture yet called "Man Shot for Making Slow Left Turn." The opposite model is one like Boston or any one of the American small towns in which you can either get home very quickly because of proximity and have the hour to yourself or to your kids or to doing sports, or conversely, spending that hour in the public, going to a cafe, going to the library, getting into political arguments with your friends. All of these things are options. In the current suburb, that is not an option. You must spend it in this vehicle. And the statistics are really quite horrendous. You know, if you commute 1 hour to work and 1 hour back, you spend 7 weeks a year in the car. And the car, on average, costs $4,500 a year. Now, you take those 7 weeks and the $4,500 and spend them in Rome instead. And you can see the kind of impoverishment of American life, which is the destiny of those who can only afford to live in the suburbs. Because, of course, what's happened is that anywhere where there's an intact urban fabric, like in Boston or Cambridge or Beacon Hill or Marblehead or Nantucket, or any one of the places that are the other model, the small-town model, real estate prices are through the roof. And all the young people can't do anything but this life. Here's a square mile. It's a very typical square mile, which is why I've selected it to show you. It happens to be west of Miami, but it contains within it all the housing and suburban types which are currently being built in the suburb. This happens to be a community college, but it could also just as well be a shopping mall or an office park. Any one of these big pieces of construction that have a sea of parking around them. It's a place where a lot of people work. Down here is a small portion of the American dream. the quarter-acre house in the curvilinear street. And over here are people who have succeeded in the American dream, and they live in one-acre parcels with much more lawn to mow, and they can indulge their dislike for their neighbors, which seems to be the American dream in some advanced form at this moment in the suburb. And over here is starter housing. Starter housing, townhouses, which also happens to be ending housing, also called empty nester places. Probably at 7 units to the acre. By the way, this all has technical names. The zoning people call it R4. The developers call it move-up housing. And you call it ranch houses. This you might call townhouses. Zoning calls it R10. And the developers call it starter housing, and so on. Here are the garden apartments for people who rent. Here are schools. There's a group of private schools and churches. Here is the shopping in the best ULI practice of putting them in the corner like that where there's more traffic. And what you have here are all the elements that make a town. There are places of work, there are places of shopping, and there are places of living for young people, for middle-class people, and for older people. And there are places for them to go to church and to go to school. You see, the remarkable thing is that the suburbs actually have all the components that make towns. But they're not assembled properly. They're assembled in separate pods. We could be laying out towns by the hundreds every single year. Look at what happens to a professor at this college who lives there. Well, normally, this would be a 5-minute walk to work in a place like Cambridge or a place like Princeton or a place like New Haven, right? But no, this is a planned suburb. There's a wall separating a function. So the professor has to get in his car, right, drive out to the collector street, come over like that, come on over, enter the college, come over here and park. Pretty much where he started, probably 3 minutes where he started. And the same thing happens here. This townhouse resident or this townhouse resident wants to get a cup of coffee after dinner, right? Well, the choices are either walking in a horrendous street, which is very unlikely, or getting in the car, driving out, and coming here. Of course, he does neither, which is why the suburbs are so notoriously dead. You have 250,000 people living in one place, and you say, God, this is Deadsville. Because there's no way to be seen as an individual. There are only cars. Now, the tragedy, in fact, is pretty substantial for that professor, because it ends up that he is working for General Motors or Toyota and for the Hartford insurance companies. That's where his savings go. Because he not only needs to have a car for himself, his wife needs a car or she is a non-entity, because there's nothing that can be done without the car. And if you have a kid who's over 16, then that kid has to have a car. And you're pretty grateful that he can have a car, because if he doesn't have a car, you have to drive him around constantly. Because the kids are one of the great tragedies of the suburbs. They cannot get around by themselves anywhere. They can't go anywhere. They often can't even go visit friends in the adjacent development. One of the tragedies about the suburbs, and it's one of the hidden tragedies, is that it is if you assume that it is the mothers who drive the kids. Well, the mothers have great difficulty in pursuing their careers, if they have careers. But there's a very personal anecdote. My sister was a journalist with the Miami Herald. She had 2 kids, and she became a chauffeur, which is her new profession, my sister the chauffeur. And the tragedy is that there was no choice, because she really could not find a place where the kids could exist by themselves. It just was not being provided in all of Miami. The suburb, it turns out, is a profoundly sexist urban pattern. The problem is not so much the amount of driving either, but the fact that every single trip, and I'm going to repeat this later, that every trip hits the main road. That is the source of the traffic congestion. Here is a completely planned suburb, very carefully done according to the latest codes. Here is the collector street. Here's one residential neighborhood, very charming. Here's another residential neighborhood, very charming. But if a kid ever had to get from here to there, it really has to be driven because there are no connectors. See? No connectings, no connectings. There's a residential to residential disconnection, which, by the way, gives rise to utter social segregation because these are quadruplexes. These are people that probably earn only $25,000 a family, while these are single-family houses, and these are people that earn $100,000 a family. And these people never live or never see these people. Complete segregation. You get this new phobia of people who are unlike yourself economically, and you really feel terrible if anything like affordable housing comes anywhere near your place of living. The relationship of residential to commercial is equally sealed. Here's a wall, and for good measure, also a drainage ditch. In case anybody here would ever want to arrive at the very handy commercial center, which is next door. No way. Out you go, driving and coming back. There is somehow the feeling left over from the Industrial Revolution, where industry was first separated from housing with good reason, that commerce will in fact kill you if it's anywhere near. That is just the end result of, or the snowballing of this original very healthy instinct that factories must be separated from residential, which was the first act of planning in the 19th century. Now the separation is absolute and everything is separated from everything else. And it is unnecessary. It is not even necessary to separate industry anymore because it doesn't smell and it doesn't make noise anymore. And in fact, you can have it pretty near to where you live without any problems at all. Here, in fact, is a place of working. Here is a place of dwelling. And here, there's a slightly different case being made here, because here there isn't a wall, right? Here there isn't a wall. These people can come right out and go to work. Why is it then that this sidewalk is disconnected? No one has bothered to build it. And there's no worn grass either. Know why? Because this street is such a miserable experience to walk on. It isn't just enough to provide proximity. It is not just enough to provide filtration. It is also necessary to detail the street in such a way that pedestrian life can occur. And that takes, there are two rules for that. One is you must provide parking on the street, and rule number two, buildings must be pulled up to the sidewalk. Let me show you a rendering that explains it perfectly. Now this is a rendering. This is made to flatter this building. There's a gentleman on the sidewalk. And look at the mistake the artist made. He slipped up and drew a semi right next to the pedestrian. And this, if you have ever experienced a semi anywhere near your body, you know that it's not something that is at all possible. A car traveling at 25 miles an hour, just 25 miles an hour, a few feet from your body, feels dangerous. The wind, the potential splashing, the potential accident, wherever cars are taken away from street, wherever parked cars do not exist, pedestrian life has a very difficult time. Cars must be allowed on the streets. Now, of course, they're not allowed in the suburbs. In the most advanced plans, parked cars are stripped from the streets, and the streets are given up entirely to automobiles and to semis. And over on the other side, what do you have? What is this pedestrian rewarded by? The hoods of parked cars, the grills, instead of a building. Now, however miserable this building is, it is still something nicer and more interesting to walk by than the hoods of parked cars. What should really happen is that this building should have been forced to come forward to here, to the sidewalk, so that the pedestrian, as they do all over Boston and all over any traditional towns, you walk by the buildings, because the buildings are interesting, what happens in the windows are interesting. Well, that's not allowed in the suburbs. In the suburbs, you have to pull your building back. And what do you do with the front lawn, or, well, the front yard? You must put the cars that would otherwise be parked on the street. Really, what should happen is that the building should be moved forward, the parking lot should go to the back, and at least some of the cars should be on the street, the way it happens in traditional towns and traditional cities. But that's not permitted anymore. That's not the model of the suburb which is in mind, because the traffic engineers want the cars to be happy. Here's an instance of an interesting adjacency. Here is an office park, and here is a shopping center. Now, this shopping center undoubtedly has a lunch place, and these are people who eat lunch right there. Now, what happens when, in fact, they want to have lunch? Do you think that any of these will actually come down the elevator, be tempted by their beautifully parked car, absolutely convenient, a car that you fall into because it's so convenient? Well, they overcome that temptation. Then they must cross the parking lot. Then when they get here, they must go over the berm. Now, you know about berms? That is the latest invention in the codes to make the suburbs somehow more palatable. You berm it to hide the parking. They're very hard to go over, and besides, you look stupid going over a berm. And human beings have a sense of dignity. You would not be caught dead going over a berm. I've tried. Well, you go over the berm. Then you face a street that is really remarkable because, it's only a two-lane road. See? One car and another car. But because the traffic engineers are in control of the roads of this country, this two-lane road has really become some monstrous width, full of hieroglyphics, all signaling to drivers who are assumed to be spastic and moronic. If you read the manuals of the traffic engineers, that's what they have in mind. You need to be warned half a mile ahead that there might be one lane less. Look at all this paint and all this extra asphalt and all this writing just to allow you to make a left turn. I mean, for God's sake. Let the drivers take care of themselves. But no, everything has to be done to maximum efficiency. So you cross 5 lanes instead of 2. You go over. This one doesn't have a berm. It's an older model. You go into the parking lot. You cross the parking lot. You go to the lunch place. Well, you know how many people have ever done that? Not one ever. You can say these things with absolute certainty. Because there's a traffic jam now at midday. Because the latest problem in the suburbs is no longer 9 o'clock and 5 o'clock, but the 12 to 1 traffic congestion as everybody goes out and tries to get lunch. It is, and again, I am talking about now details. I'm not talking about proximity because the plans that are being made now have proximity. This is proximity. This is very close. This is only 2 minutes walk. What fails is the detailing, not the proximity. Now, that was pretty funny, but this is pretty tragic. This is a school. This is a school that if you examine the edge conditions, which is to say the residential neighborhood here has a chain link fence, the road that approaches it doesn't have sidewalks. This is a school to which no child has ever walked. No child has ever gotten here except driven by an adult in some manner, either by bus or by car. Now, what is it like for a child? Presumably, this school is the primary social entity for the child. This is where they study. This is where they meet their friends. This is where they do sports. This is where they might meet. Well, no way. At 3 o'clock, whether you're having a good time, whether you want to stay at the library, whether you're playing, whatever's happening, the cars come and the buses come and you're taken away and fragmented socially into your individual dwelling. And if your parents want you to be a social entity, they have to drive you to see your friends. These are the people who particularly suffer in the suburbs because they cannot, the children, in fact, have a very difficult time leading full lives. It's one of the reasons that television is so prominent. Parents who work are forced to warehouse their kids for the 2 hours between 3 and 6 o'clock when they get there because really they can do very little to take care for themselves. They're the people who suffer. Now, there's another type of person that suffers, and I don't have a slide to show that. But seniors have in fact, they have a tragic time They, in a suburban condition, which is essentially what Florida and Arizona and California has become, seniors cannot take care of themselves once they lose their driver's license. In other words, what stops you from becoming a viable citizen is your sight, not your ability to walk. The minute you lose your license, you can no longer live by yourself, and you must be warehoused in an institution. Obviously, a traditional town permits that more active life because you can walk to places. You can continue leading a fuller life. This is what the modern plan looks like. This is a perfectly typical piece of planning submitted to a planning agency. The collector streets are here, and these are the pods with the different densities and the different functions. This might be commercial, and this might be industrial, and this is townhouses, single-family houses, and so forth. Look at the crude quality of it. Look at how coarse it is. Look at now a development done in the 1920s, approximately, actually, a smaller scale. It has several things. First of all, each color represents a different use, a different land use. Look at how finely grained it is. These edge blocks might have stores. These might be single-family houses. Here are townhouses. Look at the alleys. Look at the number of streets. Look at the many things that can happen in this small piece of ground, and look at the many ways that you can get everywhere. It's a completely different model, completely different. This is the way we used to do things until 1950. From colonial times until 1950, there were two ways of living. You either lived in a town or city, or you lived in a rural area. Now, there is another model. This one has disappeared, and now you must live in a suburb. And here's the diagram that can summarize it all. Here's a collector street. This is the congested piece. Here is a shopping center or a shopping mall with its parking and its individual connections to the shopping street. Here are the little Pizza Huts and branch banks and so forth, the little strip commercial, each with individual access to the collector street. By the way, you cannot have a pizza and deposit a check without driving out onto the collector and back again, because they're disconnected, okay? Over here is something which might be an apartment cluster or perhaps even an office park, again with its individual connection to the collector street. And over here is a residential neighborhood with your little bits of housing, the little blocks of housing and the green area. And over here is a school, each one with its individual connection. Not only can you not get from anywhere to anywhere else, but every single trip hits the collector street. There's plenty of asphalt. Don't worry. There's plenty of asphalt in the suburb, but a very small percentage is actually used. And that is the source of the problem. That is why you have the congestion of a metropolis and the culture of a farm town, which is the condition of the suburbs. It is the worst of both possible worlds. Over here, below it, is the same elements, but laid out as a traditional town. Here is the mall, visible from the highway, but also integrated into a network of streets. Here are the little highway commercial pieces. Here is the office park, and here is the residential neighborhood, and here is the school. Even if you suppose that no one will walk, let us take the worst possible case. No one will walk. People will still drive from here to the school and from here to work. Even in that case, still, the number of trips that hits the collector drop drastically, cataclysmically. They drop. Because you don't need to get on it except for 2 or 3 trips a day, which might be the trip to work or the trip to visit Granny or even to go on vacation. But you don't often have to get on the collector. You can stay within this network. Now, this is not legal to build. This is what's legal to build. In California, 2 years ago, they completed a report called the SCAG report, the Southern California Association of Governments. And they modeled the year 2010 and what the traffic would be like. And what they modeled was double-decking all their highways. You can imagine how pleasant and cheap that would be. They modeled rapid transit, they modeled the mandatory staggering of working hours, and they modeled several other things, public transit, subsidized, and they modeled bringing the places of work closer to the places of residence, like this. Their conclusion was that nothing that could be done would have anything but a cosmetic effect on the problem, except for one thing, bringing the places of work closest to the places of residence. There is only one solution. There are not several solutions. Building highways will hardly work. They become congested as soon as you finish them. It is exactly like a heart bypass operation, right? This has clogged up. You need a heart bypass operation. Build another highway. Well, that's fine. You can build another highway, and it will relieve the congestion. But unless you change the diet of the patient, it will clog up again. It is absolutely elemental. What needs to be done is change the diet so that the problem does not recur in the future. That's the lesson from California. They know it already. Currently, all over the United States, the building of highways is considered the only solution. And we are bankrupting ourselves with this. This investment in the public realm is, in fact, the source of so much of our poverty. And by that I mean a poverty of what our city halls and our schools look like. Why do they look so much worse than before? Why do post offices look so terrible? Why do schools look like supermarkets? What's wrong? There's not enough money? You know why? Because the highways are being gold-plated with the national treasure. We're not spending it where it does much more good, which is in the education of our children. Well, you say, this is all very good, but surely the developers don't understand. There must be something wrong with this small... What is the resistance? Well, the resistance is certainly not coming from developers. This is a sign for Weston, the new town, quote, unquote, in Florida, by Arvida, the largest developer in Florida and one of the largest in the country. And what they're proposing is the hometown. Well, it turns out that towns and villages and communities sell. The marketing has been done, and people would rather live in a small town than almost any other type of thing invented by man, including the golf course communities. In the 60s and early 70s, what sold housing was snobism. This is a classy place. Come live here. Your friends will envy you. That's how real estate was sold. In the late 70s and early 80s, what sold real estate was security. The man at the gate, the alarm system. You will be secure here. You're away from the problems of the cities. Well, that's fine. That's still very strong. But now community is neck and neck with security. People want desperately to live with each other that old way. They want society to be restructured. And these people with the most fabulous marketing in the world arrive at that. Now, of course, what happens when you get there is that you get the village corner store, no village, no corner, barely a store. Because the model is not being delivered, it is only being marketed. If, in fact, the developers were to deliver the real item, they would make a killing, which is something that we have proven in many of our projects. This is Seaside. Seaside sells for 6 times the comparables. Because it is a small town, and you can see palpably that it's a small town, people who buy land here pay 6 times as much as people who buy land here. Actually, they pay infinitely as much because nobody's buying any land here at all, because in fact there's a recession there. Only Seaside is selling. There is a great need for this, and the way it manifests itself is, just look at the prices in Marblehead. Just look at the prices in Nantucket. Look at the prices in Georgetown. People are overpaying drastically to live in these communities. Now, a small detail. I need to get across that it is not only the big things that are important, like mixed use, it is also some little things. And these little things are crucial. They're not optional. This is the model of housing which has been most popular in the 80s. It is called the California style in Florida. I don't know what you call it here. But it's all over the place, and it's a little townhouse that staggers back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. The more budget you have, the more staggers you get. Now, this is neither here nor there, but what is kind of interesting is that the space being formed in front here, this little space, is a pretty good proportion. It's got an asphalt, and it is very much like a street. Well, yes, it could be a street, except when you look at it, look at what happens. Here are the staggers. What happens is that this jogging back and forth, which is so popular, and by the way, so easy to do for the architects, because they never have to work out a facade. Since before you can settle on one, you're attracted to the next. You never get a chance to figure out that the proportions are awful. The basic staggering back and forth is not an optional thing, it's not a style thing, it's not an aesthetic thing, it's a technical need. The elimination of this is necessary because these buildings read as separate objects. These are objects. What you have is a building, a car, paving, and landscape. But you do not have a space. This is the kind of place that you flee indoors. There's no public life here. Now, when you take the same boxes, and I was very careful to select the worst box that I could find in Georgetown. I mean, what could be worse than black trim on a white building with a fake mansard, 3 windows across with irregular spacing, right? You know, this is about as bad as it gets. Well, this costs at least $350,000 to live here. And I think that a lot of it has to do not with this or what's inside it, but with this out here. The landscaping, the asphalt, the cars, and so forth feel entirely different because it feels like a place. When you're out here, you feel like you are someplace because the walls are lined up, and what they're doing is rather than calling attention to themselves and acting like separate objects, they're defining a public realm. They're defining the street. And the street feels like a room. Now, this is what people are paying for in the towns that we design and in places like Marblehead and places like Beacon Hill. It is the space. That can be sold at the price of gold. That's what we tell developers. In fact, the argument can be made that the tighter the space is, the more you pay for it. Do you recognize this place? I mean, is there not a coincidence that in so many places the tightest streets are the most charming and consequently the ones that people pay the most to live in? Why are developers throwing this away? This, which is completely palpable. Another thing, but related to the sense of place. The American suburb is, on the whole, to be one of individual structures like this one. Now, the American dream has a bit of a problem, and that is that it needs a front yard. And if you add the front yard to the needs of the street, the proportion of height to width is too far. It's just too big to give that sense of place which I was referring to. The Renaissance theorists said more than once that you only feel a sense of space if the proportion of height to width is no more than 1 to 6. 1 up to 6 across. Once it's more, you lose the sense of place. That is where the American tree comes in. And as you know, the American Elm Street, quote unquote, no more elms, but Elm Street as a concept, is one of the glories of world urbanism. There are streets in Siena, and there are streets in Rome, and there are streets in Paris, but a good American Elm Street is the equal of them all. And it has to do with the trees and the magnificent canopy that they make. Trees are necessary to neck the space down so that it feels like a place, so that people can go ahead and live in the American dream in a greater than 1 to 6 proportion. The trees should not be an option. They're a technical and social necessity. Now, landscape architects would rather die than plant 3 trees in a row. Instead, what they do is they take the magnificent landscaping budgets, this is in Florida, and they try to make it like the Everglades has somehow wandered in. Clump here and clump there. And actually, what they're after is really quite picturesque. I mean, this makes a good picture. It feels good. It looks pretty good, but it does not form space. It is a form of interior decorating gone outdoors. There is a place for picturesque landscaping, and it's in the park. Parks have picturesque landscaping, not the street. The street has the need to align the trees, and that should be in the codes, at least until the landscape architects learn to line up the trees. Related to the issue of separation of functions. Now, this issue of separating things, which began with separating the factory from the dwelling place, has gone absolutely berserk, and everything is separated from everything else. This is the current model for developing the suburb, in which the street has now been separated into the go lanes and the stop lanes. Now, as you remember, it is perfectly normal to drive on a street, to park on the street, and to put houses on the street, right? Those three things happen together in this slide of Georgetown. Well, that's not the current model. The current model is to separate the go street from the parking street, and to, as much as possible, separate the unit from the street itself. So this poor developer has had to spend a great deal of money building this completely unnecessary strip of asphalt, which is in any case, which is there and separate because the engineers want cars to go very quickly and be very happy. Now, that isn't very good in a residential neighborhood, which is why they put speed bumps. First you design it for 40 miles an hour, and then you hobble it to 15. Why not take the natural organic mixture of cars and houses and let the human faculties decide what speed that you can go on, which is naturally very slow when people are living on a street. Well, let's take this thing. What if we eliminated this piece? Say, developer, save yourself the money, let's use it somewhere else. Well, where we would use it is here, the American alley. One of the glories of urbanism, one of the really civilized inventions of the early 20th century. You have some in Boston, so you know what I'm talking about. It's a place where the dumpster goes, right? You know, we have become a society accustomed to walking past our garbage. The dumpster by the front door is perfectly normal. In fact, it's only possible to live the way we do thanks to the invention of the plastic trash bag. Because if that weren't there, it would be intolerable. Because these have been eliminated. But beyond that, this is a very useful device, the alley. The infrastructure can go along it, so you don't have to cut down the street trees. And most important, all the garage doors can face the rear. And that is important because if they don't face the rear, they face the front. And if they face the front, it's a perfect bore to walk past, because the house gives nothing of itself. I mean, what a hermetic facade. And these are nice little houses. You know, they're not bad. They have nice tile, nice neutral stucco, not a bad mailbox. You know, it's fine. But who would walk down this street? There is nothing being given of the life of the house. And yet, if alleys do not exist, this is unavoidable. In a medium-sized suburban lot, more than 50% of your frontage is occupied by garage doors. This is what we are not getting, and this is in Nantucket, a place that people go to just to be there. These are houses probably at exactly the same density as the earlier ones, but they're really giving an awful lot more to the street than the houses with the garage doors that I showed. Another thing having to do again with the pedestrian life and the feeling of the city, this is a shopping center in Falmouth, a charming town. A shopping center, a strip shopping center. Well, you know, you probably don't remember this because it blends right into the nice old town. Why? Because the parking is to the rear, you see, and the pedestrian life in the front has been secured, you see, by the building being brought forward, so it forms a very good neighbor to all the houses. This is Annapolis, Maryland, a perfectly delightful place. Look at how delighted this guy is. He has come to Annapolis just to hang around, to be in public space. Look at this, Laura Ashley, right? Now, Annapolis is a fantastic place. It was designed before Washington. It was designed before the Revolutionary War by the same man who designed Williamsburg. It is a town that is older than the nation. And what does it do? It has its own population. It has the population of the Naval Academy, it has the population of St. John's College, it has a tourist load which would kill anybody, and it is still a wonderful town. And they say that old towns somehow don't work. You know what doesn't work are the new suburbs. And here you have a 17th, or actually an 18th century town sustaining all that and remaining pleasant enough to become a tourist spot. How and why? Because they built the parking garages, which were necessary, but they put them within the block. They're not out here in the frontage, which would destroy the feeling of the pedestrian, because you know how boring it is to walk past parking lots. You know that because you have them here in Boston. And it's particularly boring to walk past parking garages. This is an elemental part of the code that must be, an elemental part of urbanism that must be in our codes. Now, I've included these rather urban slides because many of you are Boston dwellers. And cities are actually extraordinary examples of things that work well. And as the suburbs become denser, the rules of the city become more applicable. Here is Paris. And here in Paris, next to this man having an aperitif, is a 12-lane street. Okay, now just compare that to an American 12-laner. And imagine paying anybody anything. Imagine not being tied down. Now, how did they manage that? Well, by a complex and sophisticated understanding of all of the elements that make a street. Here you have the fast lanes, here you have the slow lanes, and here you have, integrated within the same space, 6 lanes of parking. For every 20 feet of frontage, there are 6 cars. That's a pretty big parking load. In fact, what you have here is nothing less than a high-speed highway, a slow-speed road, and a parking lot, all integrated into a perfectly delightful place, which cannot be said of a parking lot. The great thing about this conception of the street is that it's a nice place when the cars are parked there, and it's an even better place when the cars are gone. In a current modern parking lot, it's a miserable place when the cars are there, and it's still a miserable place when the cars are gone. Nothing ever gets better. It's always bad. And the landscaping is integrated like this, and different functions occur at different levels. Here's shopping, integrated with offices, integrated with rich people, integrated with poor people, everybody living together, and nobody causing anybody any harm. In fact, 9 million people living quite smoothly with each other and having quite a good time, which is more than can be said for the Route 9 people or the Silicon Valley people. Now, the suburbs are actually beginning to achieve that density. Look at this. Here's the 12-laner. This is an American version. The 12-laner. Here are the buildings of approximately the same bulk and density, but instead of it becoming Paris, or instead of it becoming Commonwealth Avenue, what do we have? We have a lot of forgettable garbage that you'd rather not be in. We are throwing away the future. Do you know why the conservation movement has reached the point of hysteria? Because everybody knows that the future will not be as good as the past. So we must preserve the past. This is a new phenomenon. Before the Second World War, the future was going to be as good as the past, and it was okay to knock down things because the things that were coming were going to be just as good. Well, that whole conception has completely changed, and we're quite right in preserving every stick of old buildings if our future is going to be like this. Now, the tragedy, of course, is that we're building the equivalent of cities. We're building the equivalents of Commonwealth Avenues. We're building the equivalents of Georgetowns and Beacon Hills and Nantuckets and all these wonderful things, except they're not as good. In fact, they're terrible. So all this energy that our generation has put in, all the growth, is going to be the heritage of misery. We will be remembered as the people who ruined America. Why? And it's absolutely unnecessary. Another technicality. Here I am for scale. This shows you that this curb radius is 3 feet. Okay? This is in Nantucket. Now, this small technicality makes all the difference. Whenever you go to an old city, you find that curb radii are 1, 2, 3, perhaps at the most 8 feet going around. Now, why is that important? It's important because the person crossing the sidewalk coming along the sidewalk, who is about to cross the street, can cross a 24-foot street by crossing 24 feet of asphalt. Look at this, right? You come right up and you cross it, and it's no big deal. Except these are no longer allowed. Right now, what they want, what the Department of Transportation and the suburban codes want, is 35 feet, or at the very least 25, but 35 is quite common, which is to say the curve starts here and sweeps back like that. What that effectively does is that crossing a 24-foot street becomes a 48-foot cross. You see, you've doubled the amount of asphalt. Now that means, since people only cross when they know they're not going to be hit by a car, people observe and they say, aha, 24 feet, at approximately 100 feet, if a car is 100 feet away, I can make it across. However, if you double it, that car has to be 200 feet away before you step off the sidewalk. Now, of course, very little crossing is going to take place by pedestrians when you've doubled the crossing time. It just becomes inconvenient, and you have destroyed pedestrian life just by this act alone of the curb. This is in the codes. So you can go ahead and you can build traditional towns that look fine and look great and maybe work, but they're really not going to work as pedestrian environments because of this guy. Okay, this is the normal 25-footer. Look at that car. It's actually tilting, taking that curve. And that's the reason the traffic engineers want the big curves, because they don't want the cars to slow up. You see, because this is considered to be a place exclusively for the automobile. You can take a 35-foot radius at 35 miles an hour, even if you're unskilled. And if you're skilled, you can do better than that. This is part of my collection of being lost in the suburbs articles. This is the story of somebody that took two days to find an address. And this is where he had a hard time finding his way around. Now, this is understandable, except that here are little guardhouses. This is a modern suburb. There's a guardhouse. Now, as you know, guardhouses actually don't keep anybody out. They give instructions on how to find your way around. Why this manic, absolutely manic need to make curvilinear streets when it is perfectly evident that most of our nicest places, Boston and so forth, are made out of either completely straight streets or at least straight segments? Well, developers have a morbid fear of the unterminated vista. They feel that if you look down a street and it goes off into the landscape, you might think you're out in the prairie and surrounded by nothing, and that's supposed to be a terrible feeling. Well, in some ways, they're right. Vistas should be terminated, but this is a pretty cheap way to terminate a vista, to be constantly turning it like that so that the vista is closed. I often liken these. By the way, these are not unpleasant. It's just dopey to be in these. I liken this to Muzak. Vaguely pleasant, but nothing that you can remember. That's the experience of the suburb, and that is why you're constantly lost. Now, what if we put this together? What if we put this need to terminate a vista together with something that terminates the vista? Okay? What if we made a straight street and then put something at the end? Well, several good things would happen. First of all, we would have elegant and honorable sites for our civic buildings. We would have landmarks by which we can guide ourselves, and that's the only way we understand the city, is by seeing the landmarks. And we would have scenes worthy of posters. Charleston actually puts this on a poster, and on the basis of this scene alone, people go to Charleston just to be there. They just show Charleston itself, and you go because of this scene. Well, you want to know something? That scene is illegal now, because the traffic engineers think that if you ever terminate a vista this way, you're going to crash into it. In fact, where people hit things is in the Department of Transportation standard highways, where they're half asleep and they hit each other. But wherever there's a certain skill and interest required, people are very much awake and they don't hit things. Well, If you ever read a book, a technical analysis of what makes old towns charming, like this 1909 textbook, which is for those of you who are planning, this is Raymond Unwin's book, Town Planning in Practice. It has 3 pages of intersections of this type, which show how when you drive down streets, you can end in wonderful fountains and wonderful statues and wonderful building facades and so forth. There are 3 pages of drawings like this, perhaps as many as 40 little illustrations, and not a single one is legal. We have actually outlawed any sophistication in the layout of our streets because of the traffic being the only reason why a street would be made. The width of streets. Nantucket, marvelous. By the way, this is a heavily New England lecture. I've changed the slides. But I can show the same things anywhere in America. The nice old streets, which are narrow. The modern streets. By the way, this is a 2-lane street. Look at this. This is a 2-lane street with parking. Look at the width in a traditional town. This is a 2-lane street without parking in a modern subdivision, because this is what it takes to make a modern American take a left turn. Look at that. Well, obviously, we're wasting a lot of money in this. What if you were to tell the developers, look, see all this asphalt? This is only used 7 days of the year. Let's not pave it. Just pave the stuff that is used on a daily or weekly basis, and let's save this, and let's just compact the soil, drain it properly, and plant beautiful trees on it, and let's just use it. It can be a wonderful place in the meantime, and then it's only used those 7 days between Thanksgiving and Christmas, which are the high-intensity shopping days. Take the money, and what to do with it? Well, what about, instead of building gang mailboxes, why not build post offices like this? You see, what we're able to do at Seaside is take the budget, which would normally go into that wasted infrastructure, and take the gang mailboxes, which now are required in the suburbs. Parenthetically, do you know why the post office is going bankrupt? Delivering in the suburbs. Have you seen those thousands of little Jeeps that go around? Hundreds of thousands of little Jeeps? Well, it is absolutely ineffective cost-wise to do that, which is why they're beginning to put the gang mailboxes. Well, that's actually a wonderful opportunity, because if you take the money from the roads and put it in and you make boxes in here, this becomes a social condenser. People come once a day to the post office where they can read the bulletin board, see who's in town, see what's happening, do some shopping in the downtown and so forth. And the other thing that you can do is, instead of building city halls that look like this, because there's absolutely no cash left after you've built this, spend it, for God's sake, in suitable civic buildings. I mean, this is in Marblehead. This incredibly wonderful building was built by fishermen and boat builders, people with much less money than developers, you know? And yet, there was enough left over. The society spun off enough fat, enough excess cash to actually ornament the civic realm. That is no longer the case. There's not enough to build anything properly in terms of buildings. Affordable housing is becoming a crisis. And yet, when you try to provide affordable housing, the people who live there have a fit. They say, no, it's going to lower my real estate value. Not at all. Let's not do it. Well, you know, they're quite right. If affordable housing were provided the way that it is provided now, which is in big clusters of 50, 60, 100 units, yes, it will lower real estate prices, because that looks like affordable housing, and it has an onus on it, and very few people behaving at not the peak of form, such as letting a car that doesn't run stay in a parking space, begins the entire thing begins decaying. And nothing is immune from that. Anywhere that large increments of affordable housing are built, they go bad. There are, however, other ways to do it, which occur habitually in traditional towns without doing any damage. The most elemental is to not make affordable housing look any different from expensive housing. And over here, there's a house, probably a historic house of some kind, that goes for a pretty expensive place. Well, next to it, what do we have but two 12-foot townhouses, right? They probably sell for a tenth what that one sells. But because the massing is approximately the same, you see, this building and this building are approximately the same, they don't look different, and it's okay to have them together. It doesn't hurt the neighborhood. In fact, the only problem with this is that it's so nice that it doesn't remain affordable. And when the original owners sell it, they're forced to enter the middle class, which they might not. Actually, it's quite nice that they're able to. But this housing stock does not generally remain affordable. It simply goes up, and the kids who live here and the grandparents who live here and want to live near their children can actually do so. There's another type, which is the dwelling above the store. And this is pretty interesting. Now, it is not for the owner of the store itself. It's a misconception. When people say people won't live above their store, they're right. Anybody who owns a liquor store is not going to live above it. They can afford a single-family house somewhere nearby. Who lives above the store are the people who, the clerks in here and the clerk in the drugstore and the waiter in the restaurant. They live above the store, and they're very grateful to do it. They don't need a car, so on and so forth. This is an important prototype because there are certain areas in which the price of each lot for housing is so expensive that it is actually impossible to provide affordable housing. If the price per lot is $35,000, as it often is in places like Cape Cod, well, you cannot build a house cheap enough that it would become affordable. However, if it were permitted that you could live above the store, well, the store could account for the price of the real estate. After all, in a shopping center, the store takes care of the price of real estate. And then the housing on top can be delivered for the price of construction alone. Just what it costs to build. That is truly affordable housing, and in fact it remains affordable because this is not necessarily the American dream, and people don't overpay for it necessarily. So that's a good prototype, and as to the old broken record, of course, it's illegal to do this. You can't do this. The last, and one of the best, is the outbuilding. The little building, this happens to be a garage that has been converted to a little dwelling. The outbuilding is an ancient American tradition. Williamsburg is full of them. Nantucket is full of them. Old towns have them. Here's the main house, and in the back of the main house is a little building. Generally, this building should not be more than 500 square feet. The result of a small dwelling like this is that within the same piece of real estate, somebody who has enough money to own their own house is living with someone who can barely afford the rent of anything but a $500 apartment. What you've done is you have integrated in the same piece of land radically different income groups, which is the ideal. The ideal is to integrate people who earn different amounts of money. This is a good system because the owners of the principal house police the other house. So any kind of behavior that would somehow be unacceptable, like rock music too loud or, whatever, in fact, is not a problem with the police department. It is a problem of the principal owner. So they tend to be beautifully tended. And socially, they're terrific. Kids, teenagers stay at home later than they otherwise might. Widowed parents live with the family without disturbing the son or daughter-in-law excessively. Lots of good things happen. In fact, in Australia, if you can call for one and the government will deliver an outbuilding to you and give you a tax break on it. That is how positive an element it is considered to be. However, in this country, guess what? It's illegal. You can't have outbuildings. They're zealously policed. You cannot have detached dwellings. They check to make sure you're not putting plumbing for a kitchen and so forth. The reason is that they do not want a single-family lot to become a two-family lot because that would overload the infrastructure, and they're right. However, if you limit the size so that it is the equivalent of, so that only a single person or a couple can live in it, well then, it doesn't overload the infrastructure. It is the equivalent of one additional bedroom. That's all. And it would go a great distance towards resolving the affordable housing problem if they were permitted. For example, if these were permitted in Cape Cod, well, a lot of people would build them, and a lot of them would be rented to the people who make hamburgers, and so on and so forth. This is a beautiful wetland in Florida. You also have wetlands here. They are In the past 20 years, enormous strides have been made in preserving the environment. Where we are failing, in fact, is in the human ecology. You see, the current planning which is in place and the current moves towards planning are really only about traffic. That isn't enough. It is necessary to reconstruct our society the way it used to be by making civic space, which is a set of elements that I am now tired of describing, but which are perfectly achievable. They're perfectly achievable. And it is this ecology, the human ecology movement, which really must be the agenda for the 90s. And if you have a nostalgia for the great battles, if you're tired of just smelling the smoke and really want to see the fire, this is the place to fight. It's a terribly exciting situation. Anyway, thank you for listening so long.